Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Zoom event, the Anthropology of Adornment and Identity at Somerset Place. We're so glad that you're joining us for this event, which is part of Somerset's commemoration of Black History Month. My name is Karen Hayes, and I'm the site manager here at Somerset Place State Historic Site, and I'll be serving as your host. If you'd like to learn more about Somerset Place State Historic Site, please visit our website at historicsites.nc.gov/Somerset Place, Somerset, or you can simply follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or come to the site to visit us in person at 2572 Lakeshore Road. We're right here in Cressville, North Carolina. We're open from Tuesdays through Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. A few quick housekeeping tips before we get started. We ask that you would please keep your microphones muted throughout the program, and please type any questions you may have for our guest speaker into the chat function, which is located at the bottom portion of your screen. At the end of the program, I will ask our speakers as many of your questions as possible as time allows. It is now my honor to introduce the speaker this morning, Kiana Fekette. Kiana received her Bachelor's of Arts in Archaeology with a second major of History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2016. During the summer of 2021, Kiana graduated with a Master of Arts in Anthropology from North Carolina State University. The title of her thesis is Beads, Buckles, Buttons, and Pipes, Embodiment of Identity at Somerset Place, North Carolina.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Karen. So again, hi, my name is Kiana Fekette, and I had a specific focus in historical archaeology when writing my thesis, which combines the traditional research methods of historical analysis through written documentation with the human artifact-based analysis of archaeology. And the field of historical archaeology is uniquely suited to give a voice to the unheard. Historical documentation like correspondence, government records, diaries, ledgers, and the like are overwhelmingly dominated by wealthy, male, Christian, Eurocentric experiences. And women are represented, but again, it's nearly always through that wealthy Eurocentric lens. And meanwhile, artifacts can tell us so much more about a person or group of people. Learning to read between the lines of historical documentation and seeking out things written by those not often represented in the historical record can be combined with the analysis of artifacts and features found through archaeology to tell a more complete story about the people who lived before us. And so this presentation is a very brief summary of my research conducted as a graduate student at NC State. And my thesis was driven by two primary research questions. How did enslaved individuals create and maintain a sense of identity through the use of personal adornment? And do these items indicate any particular cultural affiliation, or are they uniquely associated with enslaved communities throughout North America? And if you could go to the next slide, that would be great.
It's not moving. You have to do it on the thing on the screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So why identity and adornment, and what exactly does that mean?
The actual
material objects are used by humans to make sense of the world. They can provide mental stability, structure, and meaning to our lives in many different ways. And in situations of enslavement, individuals are physically controlled by the slaveholder, but maintain authority over their internal thoughts and feelings. And through material culture, and more specifically, objects used to adorn the body, enslaved individuals may display a visual representation of their self-view and maintain some form of autonomy. So studies on personal adornment and material culture in general are much needed in the research of historically underrepresented groups like African Americans. Excavations of dwellings associated with enslaved life at other large plantations have uncovered artifacts like decorative buttons, beads, combs, and other things that were used to shape a person's visual presentation to the world. There have also been signs of reuse of everyday objects like coins with holes pierced through them that may indicate deeper personal meaning beyond just simple frugality. Items could be purchased, traded for, handed down, stolen, crafted, or simply found. They could be used for their original purpose, like a button as a simple clothing fastener, or adapted to suit other needs, like creating a necklace. Through the active choice of acquiring, using, and reusing specific objects, enslaved individuals asserted their autonomy and passed along important information about personal identity and group affiliation. So by studying the physical evidence for clothing and adornment, archaeologists may enrich the existing knowledge of agency and identity in times of slavery and within the African diaspora. So what makes up adornment? Simply put, it's any object that somebody uses to place upon or close to their body. And this can be things that come to mind that are really obvious, like jewelry. So anything like beads, brooches, necklaces, earrings, bracelets, buttons and buckles, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, were really decorative, and they could tell a lot about a person, including their social and economic status, their religious beliefs, their political views, the ability to purchase from certain markets, and more. And clothing itself, we all make conscious and unconscious choices about the clothing that we wear every day. And unfortunately, clothing does not often survive in the archaeological record. Even in museums and antique sales, the clothing there is really exceptional, and it often comes from a wealthy owner who could afford to only wear it a number of times and then preserve it throughout the decades and centuries and pass it down, instead of cutting it up and reusing it or letting it just simply disintegrate through constant use and reuse. But lost items like buttons, pins, and buckles can reveal a great deal about the type of garment worn and the quality of it. And as the quantity of adornment items is quite small at Somerset Place, I coupled them with items of personal use. And these include combs, coins, tobacco pipes, sewing needles, clothing pins, slate pencils, musical instrument parts. So pretty much anything that a person could use to have as a physical representation of their personal and cultural identity. And if we could go to the next slide. Okay. And to give a super brief overview of the history, in 1786, a group of over 80 men and women were forcibly taken from Africa, and they arrived in the swampy intercoastal lands of eastern North Carolina and forced to work digging canals and drainage ditches to reclaim land for agriculture. And over the next 80 years, these enslaved workers and their descendants lived and worked on what became one of the largest plantation complexes in the Upper South that was owned by Josiah Collins and his descendants. And the area is incredibly remote, with the largest city of Edenton was several days away across the Albemarle Sound. A trusted select few enslaved workers were permitted to visit Edenton at least once a year at Christmas. And this indicates that they potentially had access to a wider range of available material goods. And for those who were still confined to the area, we know that the Collins family kept a small commissary for the enslaved and free workers, which stocked items like clothing, mirrors, ceramics, and musical instruments. Ledger books that were kept detail multiple instances of money or specific goods given to enslaved workers. For example, Melvin Jones was given $1.25 for unspecified extra work in 1846, and Elsie and Juba were given a shawl and flannel, respectively. And although performance of extra or exemplary work did benefit the enslaved workers by allowing them some monetary freedom, this payment of cash or credit and quote gifts of items like cloth ultimately served as means of control. And aside from the plantation commissary, the closest stores to Lake Phelps were in Edenton or in Plymouth, which is a town about 20 miles to the west. And this meant that the majority of the enslaved population had to rely on the basic clothing rations given out each year and the goods selected by Collins himself to be sold at the store on his plantation for a price that he himself determined. Yet, despite this lack of choice in adornment and personal use objects, the enslaved population found ways to adapt and maintain their cultural and personal identities. So in 1843, there was a population list created that reveals the names of 279 enslaved individuals living in each of the cabins that were constructed in a straight row that was aligned parallel to the lake shore. And by this time, the majority of the enslaved population had been born locally, and most of the African-born workers had passed away. Yet some of their African traditions were still carried on. When a Dr. Edward Warren visited the plantation sometime during the mid-1800s, he observed a unique combination of Episcopalian Christianity and spiritual practices, typically associated with African rituals. And he also gave a detailed description of what was called a John Coonering celebration, which happened at Christmas, during which one person would dress in an elaborate costume and be accompanied by others in, quote, fantastic ribbons, rags, and feathers, end quote, who would sing, dance, and play musical instruments. And although Dr. Warren's accounts are limited in scope, they indicate a clear retention of some cultural practices that serve to unite the enslaved population. Warren himself at the time remarked that it was an unusual sight that he had never witnessed in America, and that it was likely based on festivities, quote, inherited from African ancestors, end quote. So what's incredible is that Warren was actually correct. The John Coonering festivities were a highly unique cultural practice, only conducted in that coastal Carolina region and in specific areas of the Caribbean. There's a specific cultural connection that ties these two populations together, which gives us a little bit of an insight into where the enslaved populations of these regions originated from. And if we could go to the next slide. Okay. So to give a brief overview of the archaeological excavations that were conducted at Somerset, in the 1940s, there were plans to revitalize the site into a historic state landmark. However, many of the original buildings were either in severe disrepair or had been lost to time altogether. Historian William Tarleton was tasked with identifying the locations of lost buildings and walkways in the 1950s. And, excuse me. And through excavation and historical research, Tarleton identified a number of foundations, including one of an unidentified large building near the lake shore that appears in an 1821 map. And the next archaeological excavations didn't occur until the 1980s, and the artifacts recovered from 1981 and 1982 make up the core of my thesis. So the main focus of the 1981 field school was to establish a formal archaeological grid and to explore a large unknown structure that Tarleton first mentioned in his report. And that's the one that's circled in purple on the map. And structure 2, which is circled in red, was likely constructed in the late 18th century based on historical documentation, and was likely standing and occupied through at least the end of the 19th century. And that structure was explored in 1982. And the next slide, please. So according to historical evidence, researchers initially believed that structure 1 was a commissary or a kitchen for the enslaved community and constructed around 1796 with a demolition date of around 1830. And across the whole of Structure 1, a total of 40 artifacts related to this hypothesized period of occupation and use were recovered. Interestingly, there are clear differences in the types and quantity of artifacts found in this unknown structure compared with Structure 2, which was a known dwelling. However, the size of the hearth in Structure 1 is similar to those found in Structure 2, suggesting that this fireplace wasn't originally meant for large-scale cooking like you would see in a traditional kitchen. So without historical documentation, it's kind of impossible to truly determine exactly how this first structure was used, but the artifact assemblage does suggest a functional difference. And next slide, please. So these are just some of the artifacts that were recovered from this first structure. Of note, a nearly perfect button made out of a white metal called tombak was recovered. And this type of button dates from about 1760 to the early 1800s. And another one of those buttons shown at the top left with a broken off side was also recovered. And as to be expected with archaeology, the earliest items were found in the lowest level of the house. And these include 3 metal buttons that were created during that same time frame, the 1760s to the 1800s, and 3 tobacco pipe bowl fragments. There were also some other items that were found, probably dating from the late 19th century and into the 20th century, which include fragments of a leather shoe and buttons from heavy-duty work pants that are likely just a result of constant use of the site in general. And if we could go to the next slide. So as said before, Structure 2 was likely constructed in the late 18th century. This is based on historical documentation, and it remained standing and occupied through at least the end of the 19th century. And it's the foundations of this structure that they reconstructed Suki Davis house is based upon. The excavators called this house the Eye House due to the presence of a hearth at either end of the building. So it's shaped like a big eye. And that's the letter, not the body part. And it was used for the enslaved population as housing and continued to be used by sharecroppers into the late 19th century and probably into the early 20th century. As a result of this longer period of occupation, there's a greater number of artifacts that were recovered, and they span from historical ceramics from the late 1700s to modern bottle glass and metal tools. And the next slide, please. So the excavation units associated with a circa 1800 two-story dwelling, Structure 2, show a wider range of artifacts. And the dating of these correlates with previous statements that the last of the dwellings continued to be used by tenant and sharecropping farmers until about the late 1920s. And across the whole of Structure 2, a total of 48 artifacts related to adornment and personal use were recovered, and 37 of those are likely from the antebellum period of occupation. And there were a large range of metal buttons, some with visible back stamps, that were found in various states of preservation. And these items may have been accidentally dropped and lost under floorboards, or in the case of the broken buttons, they may have just been discarded when the shank broke off. There are also quite a number of tobacco pipe fragments that were found as well. And next slide, please. There were a couple of rather remarkable artifacts that were recovered, and they hint at the constant balance of personal and cultural identity among the enslaved residents. There were imported gilt buttons stamped with the words color and double gilt that were found. There was a colorful glass bead and a large brass button, which was created for the presidential inauguration of Andrew Jackson. And all of these suggest a greater concern for personal appearance that could be satisfied through purchases or gifts of higher quality items. And next slide, please. Oops. And to the left is that Andrew Jackson presidential campaign button. And in the middle is a whole button that is in rather poor condition, but it has evidence of that back stamp that tells us it's from about the turn of the century, so about 1800. And to the far right is a bone awl. And so the large presence of completely plain copper buttons throughout the site suggests that the enslaved population was probably clothed in relatively cheap utilitarian clothing with unremarkable decorative elements. Some buttons are quite special. So the Andrew Jackson button that we're seeing is the back of the button, actually, with the shank is broken off. And this points to the political leanings of the Collins family, who may have procured the buttons as a set before passing them or the garment to which they were attached along. And the inclusion of Andrew Jackson's name and political campaign into the lives of the free and enslaved families of Somerset Place demonstrates a connection among enslavers in the political realm. And despite that, the fact that enslaved and free people of African descent could not vote, their lives and bodies were continuously politicized in local and regional and national contexts through restrictions of movement, dress, speech, appearance, education, and much more. Of the recovered artifacts from the 1981 and 82 excavations, none of them show evidence of deliberate repurposing or recycling, which is rather surprising, as many researchers have noted reuse and recycling at similar sites associated with African slavery. And it's entirely possible that these items were missed during excavation, as they are very small and they don't often survive the test of time. And the simple handmade bone awl to the right is the only artifact recovered from either structure that is related to sewing or clothing construction. It tapers to a blunt point and was probably used for punching holes through leather, wood, or cloth. So unfortunately, the assemblage of artifacts from the 1981 and 1982 excavations is quite small, but a comparative study of artifacts from later excavations of other dwellings on the site may reveal key differences in items, depending upon proximity to the Collins mansion and the status of the inhabitants based on their occupation, seniority, gender, age, etc. And the structures explored in later excavations in 1992 and 94 date from the early 1800s, and these remained in use during the sharecropping and tenant farming periods of the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Total counts of these artifacts indicated a sizable number related to personal use, clothing, and adornment, and these include things like glass beads, sewing needles and other notions, watch components, musical instrument parts, straight razors, coins, and hundreds of buttons, some of which may show indication of reuse and recycling. And these thousands of artifacts from these later excavations have yet to be fully examined. I would have loved to have done it, but I just simply did not have time or resources to do it. I can only hope that someone will follow behind my research to analyze them and reveal even more information about the ways in which material culture was used by the enslaved workers at Somerset Place to express cultural identity, form a tight-knit community, and maintain a sense of personal independence through the acquisition and use of adornment items. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay, are there any questions?
Hey.
Hi,
Hey,
are there any
Karen. Hi,
questions?
Kiana.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, how are you doing?
Pretty well. How about yourself?
Good. Thank you so much for this. This was wonderful. If it's not too much trouble, could you put the map up again of the different sites like structure 1 and structure 2? I think I was looking at it wrong.
Okay, give me a second.
Kiana, I used to work at Somerset. I was there for about 4 years, and I read a lot of those archaeological reports, but this was really good because I mean, it's been so long since I read some of that stuff, and you just, the light you've shed on some of these objects is really great.
Thank you. Yeah, the reports they're not great, I'll be honest. They're not great. And it took me honestly months to be able to piece everything together. The record keeping was just not very good, especially for the 1950s and 80s excavations. But luckily, the 90s and the later ones are much better. So
Yeah.
hopefully somebody will have an easier time of it if they do more research.
Yeah, I think mostly I read the ones from the 90s.
Yeah, those
yeah,
are nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought I was looking at your map wrong because structure 1, is that along the lake shore? Or is
Yeah.
that along? Okay, so is that the building that might have been some kind of like fishing? I don't remember now, like what we said that building might have been when we were given tours.
I'm not entirely sure what they would have said in tours. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come out to the site just due to COVID and scheduling.
Oh no, I gotcha.
Yeah, it's a real bummer. But in the reports that I read from the 80s, they had speculated that it could have been maybe a commissary or an early kitchen. But I think it might have been like a multiple use type of thing, just based on the artifacts that were found there, even beyond the adornment and tobacco pipes and things. It definitely seems like it was probably lived in at one point. I'm not entirely sure. Unfortunately, it's just kind of speculation based on some evidence.
Yeah, that might have been the building that we talked about as the store where enslaved people could acquire certain things. Okay.
Okay, is
So
this I'm sorry, is this the screen that we wanted to see?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks. Here. I believe that's the fish house, Kathy, that has not been reconstructed. That's the only building that I can think that would have been. There was a fish house that was located near the shoreline of Lake Fells.
Okay, so that's roughly where the stage is now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I hadn't read about there being a fish house, but if I'm remembering correctly, I think I did find like a fishing sinker for a net in association with that area. So that would have made sense.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. I don't believe there's any in chat. No, there's no questions in chat. Kiana, I have one question. The beads, the glass bead that you found, it's typical of some enslaved people to wear beads as adornments, and some also for religious ceremonies and things of that sort. do we have any idea how old the glass bead that you found in our collection, how old that particular piece was?
So the thing about glass beads is that they're really hard to date, unfortunately. But based on, if I remember correctly, let me pull it up really quick. I think it was found in a lower level of the house, which suggests it was probably, let me see. Okay, it was found in about the same association as the Andrew Jackson button, so it could possibly be from the early 19th century. But unfortunately, beads are really hard to track unless if they're super specific for some reason. But this is like a very common type of bead with the stripes, but it is really nice.
We have another question. Can everyone hear me? Okay. In the first picture, the woman was wearing a beautiful head wrap. Could this have been for a wedding?
Maybe. It's a painting that was done in the late 18th century by a Frenchman. We don't really know much about it. I don't think it's just called Portrait of a Young Woman. I thought it was a really nice representation of the kind of adornment that somebody might have worn, with just a simple earring and a really pretty pearl necklace. But the color white associated with weddings didn't really come around until, I think, Queen Victoria in like the 1840s or 50s, something like that. So unless that there's a different significance in African cultures, which admittedly I'm not knowledgeable of, so it could be, or it could just be a really beautiful headdress.
Okay, I will say that headdresses were used for like weddings and things of that sort. Also, even everyday common wear, head wraps were used to protect for a field hand their heads and from the sun when they were working in the fields. So but that one was very kind of, I recall seeing it now. It was more like for a formal dress type of head wrap. So I hope that answered the question. We have any other questions?
Kiana, have you published any articles yet, or a thesis or dissertation on this?
I published my thesis, which is available through NC State for free.
Okay.
Yeah, if you Google my name, it should come up, but I haven't published any articles or anything like that in formal settings.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. So that will conclude our event for this afternoon. Well, almost afternoon. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and a special thanks to you, Kiana, for sharing your research and your knowledge with us. Again, we're in the process of commemorating Black History Month, and I thought it was very fruitful to share some of the history that we have here and what others are doing out in the field. So we thank you so much for sharing your information with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.